So this video comes off the back of one of Matt Bishop's On This Day tweets, which is one of the few shining lights on that absolute cesspit that is Twitter. I know, get off it and all that stuff, but when you do stuff like this all the time, you kind of need to be on it, because you get given ideas from Matt Bishop, as it so happens. But the On This Day that he was talking about is that today is 25 years to the day that David Coulthard moved over for Mika Hakkinen at the Australian Grand Prix because of a gentleman's agreement. It was very sporting of David, to be fair. He had an agreement with Hakkinen and went through with it. But one of the comments underneath that On This Day post was to the effect of, why don't people have the same amount of hatred to this as they do for Austria 2002? Austria 2002, you say? That was an interesting one, wasn't it? The 2002 season was, let's be honest, the Michael Schumacher show. The Ferrari F2002 was by far the class of the field, and even though Schumacher had used the previous season's F2001 for the first 2 rounds of that season, he'd finished every race on the podium, and prior to Austria, the only race he hadn't won was at Malaysia, which was won by his brother. His teammate Rubens Barrichello hadn't had the same fortune, retiring from the first 3 rounds of the season, but helped Ferrari achieve a 1-2 at Imola before not starting in Spain. But at Melbourne, Rubens had been on pole, and at Imola he'd had the fastest lap. But still, by the time the F1 circus came to the A1 ring in Austria, the performance was pretty telling. Schumacher had 44 points going into that round, while Rubens had just 6. So Rubens needed to find some sort of form. The early part of the season hadn't been going his way, and with the F2002 being the absolute monster it was, results should have been falling into his lap rather than, well, not having them. But when they did go to Austria, it looked like he'd finally found the form he was looking for. Schumacher was fastest in the first practice session, but in the second, Barrichello found the pace and confidence he'd been lacking so far, beating Schumacher albeit by just 0.03 of a second. Schumacher would then be fastest in the third and fourth sessions, and then it was on to qualifying. 2002 was the last year of the single session 1 hour time limit with 12 laps to set your best time format, which equates roughly to 4 hot laps assuming each car only did 1 flying lap at a time. Rubens' session was completely different to Michael's, with it seeming like Michael now had the bad luck and Rubens was the form driver, almost like they'd swapped cars or something. Michael had brake issues and got held in traffic, so swapped to the spare car but still couldn't make that work. Now I'd say he was only third, but bear in mind here that this was the first time he'd not started on the front row since the previous year's Italian Grand Prix. As it was, Michael was over half a second slower than Rubens, with the 2 Williams cars splitting them and quick Nick in 5th. Then you'd got Raikkonen's McLaren, Massa's Sauber, Coulthard's McLaren, and then Panis and Salo completing the top 10. At the start of the race, Rubens got a great start and Schumacher slotted into second behind him, overtaking his brother. Meanwhile, behind them, quick Nick had managed to dispatch with the 2 Williams cars, so it was Barrichello, Schumacher and Heidfeld for the opening portion of the race. Other than a safety car for Panis' BAR stopping on the start-finish straight, the race was going without major incident. But on lap 28, just 1 lap after the safety car period ended, there was that Austria shunt, when Heidfeld locked his rear brakes rounding Young's Minardi and careened into the side of Sato's Jordan, clip of which will be in the description. And it took Professor Sid Watkins 10 minutes to get the shaken Japanese driver out of his car, and it later turned out the reason Sato couldn't get out of the car was because the Sauber had hit the Jordan so hard the safety cell had bent in such a way the cockpit opening was shrunk. That, and Sato had got soft tissue damage to his leg. Once that was cleaned up, the race continued, and on lap 63, Barrichello, who was still leading the race by this point, received that team instruction, which wasn't let Michael through for the championship. That was the previous year where he had to let Schumacher go for second so that Schumacher could gain some extra points over Hakkinen, Coulthard and those guys around him. Rubens then responded by telling Todt he'd made a promise saying he wouldn't do this to a driver. Todt reminded him that he had to preserve Ferrari's best interests and if he didn't comply, he'd be fired. On the ITV broadcast, Ted Kravitz had noticed that a note had been passed from Todt to Ross Brawn, and James Allen and Mark Blundell in the commentary booth wondered, nah, they're not going to. They won't. Michael's too far in the lead of the championship, they won't bother to do it now. It was not until the final lap that Barrichello finally slowed, letting Schumacher win just metres from the finish line. The final gap between the two of them was just over a tenth or so, resulting in one of the closest finishes in F1 history, even if the ending wasn't... well, it wasn't exactly natural, was it? And then the fallout began. When they crossed the line, there was an audible gasp of shock from Blundell, and both commentators struggled to find words to describe what they'd just seen. There was audible booing as the drivers got out of their cars and went out onto the podium, and when they did get onto the podium, Michael nudged Rubens onto the top step. So Rubens is stood there on the top step of the podium while the German national anthem is being played for the guy who's standing now on the second step of the podium, but they both went onto the top step for the Italian national anthem, which was played for Ferrari. Montoya, meanwhile, is standing there trying not to wet himself laughing, and when the actual trophies were handed out, the Austrian Chancellor handed Schumacher the winner's trophy, which he promptly handed to Barrichello. Yeah, it was all pretty messed up as they tried to basically undo the embarrassment that they'd all just caused. Afterwards, Ferrari was fined, not for the team orders, but for the messing around of the podium ceremony, and rules were later put in place to prevent such a thing happening again. I say again, the rule lasted 7 years until Fernando is faster than you happened. And just like with Multi-21, there's going to be two sides to the argument. There's going to be people that will side with Schumacher and Ferrari, and others that will side with Barrichello. On one side, you've got the only one person can win the championship, Rubens was out of it, so they needed to put Schumacher first opinion, and on the other side, you've got it was totally unnecessary. Rubens was beating Schumacher totally on merit and needed the result, only for it to be taken away from him. Schumacher would still have more than 20 points on Montoya, and him and that car was so overpowered that season. And at the same time, people were saying it was unnecessary because of the fact that Ferrari and the Michael were so dominant. A Ferrari would win all but 2 Grand Prix that year. Malaysia, won by Ralphina Williams, and Coulthard at Monaco being the other. I guess some of it is down to the driver and team you support. That's going to sway your opinion either way, because there will be biases in play for this and other things I've talked about. Well, not just now, but through the however long I've been doing these videos. There will be people that will see absolutely no problem with this, who think that Australia 98 was completely wrong. That Germany 2018 was because of the princess in car 44 not wanting a challenge, and Multi-21 being bad because of the so-called arrogant German prick not listening to orders. Conversely, there's going to be people that were fine with Valtteri James and Multi-21, but not fine with this. I mean, there's a ton of examples that I can drag up just by searching the Autosport forums and going as far back as 2002 or 1998 or 2010 or 2018, but at that point we're just going to be going into a fan versus fan debate, and that's not what this video is really about. It's about the team orders that Ferrari employed and the ethics behind them and what we as fans think of them. I haven't really thought this one through, have I? In reality though, digging into the ins and outs and reading and watching interviews, it seems that the entire situation was badly handled by everybody. By Todt, by Brawn, by Michael, and by Rubens. Todt and Brawn for denying a driver a season-saving performance, Barrichello for waiting for the last possible moment to move over, and Michael for the gestures made on the podium, as sporting and gentlemanly as they were or might have appeared to be. At the time, people argue that if Schumacher clearly had a problem with this whole team orders thing, why did he not use his position in the team to say, nah, it's all good, Rubinho can have this? As already mentioned, the FIA made sweeping changes to team orders for the 2003 season, basically banning any team orders. Well, the official word was team orders that influence the outcome of a race, which, well, how do you police that? Afterwards, Max Mosley wrote a letter to the Chancellor of Austria apologising for the absolute kerfuffle that had happened on his podium, and the fine that Ferrari received was split 3 ways. Ferrari paid a chunk, Schumacher paid a chunk, Barrichello paid a chunk. But what's quite funny here is that Ron Dennis, who had zero reason to like Schumacher and Ferrari and Maranello and Italy and, well, anything colourful, really, he actually said that these team orders were okay. I know. Weird, isn't it? But given reliability being what it was in those days, you could say at the time there was no guarantee that the season would be as dominant as it turned out to be. And you can look at the 2017 season as an example. In Bahrain, Bottas had to move over for Hamilton, and by the time the season reached Austria that year, Hamilton trailed Vettel by 14 points. Had they not swapped, that gap would have been 17 points. And that could have made the difference come the end, but as we know, there was the Southeast Asian implosion. Likewise, Vettel had been put into the lead at Monaco at the expense of Raikkonen through some trickery with Ferrari strategy. I know that's an oxymoron in itself, and he'd gained points there too. If not, the gap going into the Austrian Grand Prix would have been 7 points, if my maths hasn't failed me. In that season, both sides and both fan bases could argue that those orders were needed. But as it was, Schumacher would have the title wrapped up by the French Grand Prix, the earliest the title has ever been sewn up, and it was a season of dominance not seen in a decade when Mansell won the championship, which only adds to the whole "this was totally unnecessary" thing. But at Indianapolis, Schumacher looked to return the favour, staging a photo finish as they came across the line to gift Rubens a win. But there are reports out there suggesting this was a publicity shot that went wrong, saying that it was supposed to be a form finish, Schumacher leading and Barrichello second, because 1 and 2 on the cars, so it was all a form finish publicity shot for Vodafone, who owned Verizon in the United States at that time. But I think that's just one of those long-standing Reddit myths. So then I look back at the, pretty weird ending to the 2002 Austrian Grand Prix. Do you remember that race? Did you watch it live? Were you as hacked off as a lot of other people were? Or are you one of these people that thinks, it was justified because it's Formula 1, that's what happens? Leave any opinions down in the designated comment submission zone underneath this video and get a discussion going. Massive thanks as ever to the kind folk at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help out with the image buying and other stuff, a link to Patreon, the Sato Smash, my F1 store affiliate link, which now defaults to English, hopefully, my Discord and my socials are all down in the description. And obviously, like, subscribe, bell on, and all that other stuff to get this thing fired around the internet. And there's super thanks down there too, if you're just interested in buying me a coffee or a beer or whatever. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. Goodbye.